The conference room at Helix Biotech was a sterile cage of glass and steel, its walls reflecting the cold ambition of its CEO, Margaret Langston. At 48, Margaret was a titan in the pharmaceutical world, her name synonymous with ruthless innovation. Helix had pioneered treatments that saved millions, but the cost of her empire was etched into the lines of her fascia, deep, unyielding, like the contracts she signed without blinking. Her daughter, Elise, was the only softness she allowed herself, though even that was complicated. At 22, Elise was a shadow of the vibrant girl she'd been, confined to a wheelchair since a skiing accident 3 years prior shattered her spine. The best surgeons in the world had tried and failed to restore her mobility. Margaret had poured millions into research, into experimental treatments, into anything that promised hope, but hope was a currency she was running low on. Elise sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. Her wheelchair was a sleek, custom model. Margaret spared no expense, but it was a cage all the same. Her auburn hair fell in waves over her shoulders, framing a face that was pale but fierce, her green eyes burning with a defiance that refused to let the world pity her. She was studying bioinformatics at Columbia, or at least she had been until the accident. Now, her days were a blur of physical therapy, doctors' visits, and her mother's relentless optimism, which felt more like pressure than love. Margaret stood at the head of the conference table, addressing a room full of lab-coated scientists and suited investors. Helix was on the cusp of launching a neural regeneration drug, Synaptra, that promised to revolutionize spinal cord injury treatment. The data was promising. The rats had regained partial mobility, and early human trials showed flickers of success, but it was years from market. Margaret's voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a scalpel. "We're not here to inch forward," she said. "We're here to leap. I want results, not excuses." Her gaze flicked to Elise, a fleeting moment of vulnerability no one else caught. Elise didn't look back. She was tired of being her mother's cause. The room buzzed with tension, but no one spoke up. No one dared. Helix's boardroom was a battlefield, and Margaret was its general, until the door opened, unannounced, and a man stepped in. He was unremarkable at first glance. He mid-40s, lean but not imposing, with dark hair streaked with gray and a flannel shirt that looked out of place among the tailored suits. His name was Daniel Harper, a single father and neuroengineer who'd been hired 6 months ago to consult on Synaptra's neural interface. He carried a worn leather satchel and a quiet confidence that didn't match his modest title. Heads turned, some with irritation, others with curiosity. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Harper, this is a closed meeting." "I know," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. He set his satchel on the table, ignoring the glares. "I'm here about Elise." The room went still. Elise's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. Margaret's face hardened. But before she could speak, Daniel continued. "I've been working on something outside the Synaptra project, a neural bypass system. It's not the Aria it's built, and I think it can help her walk again." The audacity of it stunned the room. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "You've been working on an unauthorized project." Her tone could have frozen the Hudson. Daniel didn't flinch. "I use my own time, my own resources. This isn't Helix's tech, it's mine, and I'm offering it to Elise. If she wants it." He looked at her then, not Margaret. Elise's breath caught. No one ever spoke to her like that, like she was the one in charge of her own future. Margaret stepped forward, her heels clicking like gunfire. "You're out of line, Harper. My daughter's care is handled by the best minds in the world, not some side project from She stopped short of saying nobody, but the word hung in the air. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed on Elise. "I'm not promising miracles," he said, "but I've seen what this tech can do. It's a direct neural interface, bypassing the damaged spinal cord to reconnect brain signals to muscle. I've tested it on simulations and small-scale trials. It's ready for a human subject. If you're willing, Elise, I'd like to show you." Elise's heart pounded. She'd heard promises before. Real doctors, researchers, all claiming breakthroughs that fizzled into nothing. But there was something about Daniel's steady gaze, the way he spoke to her, not at her. "Why me?" she asked, her voice low but cutting through the room's tension. "Because you deserve a chance," Daniel said simply. And because I know what it's like to feel trapped. He didn't elaborate, but there was a weight to his words, a story he wasn't telling. Elise glanced at her mother, whose face was a mask of fury and fear. Margaret didn't trust anyone she couldn't control, and Daniel was a wild card. But Elise was tired of being controlled, tired of being the poster child for her mother's redemption arc. "Show me," Elise said, her voice steady. The room exhaled. Margaret's eyes flashed, but she didn't contradict her daughter. Not yet. Daniel nodded, pulling a tablet from his satchel. He knelt beside Elise, showing her schematics, a sleek exoskeletal frame, wired with microelectrodes that could interface directly with her nervous system. "It's not a cure," he said. "It's a tool. Your brain tells the frame what to do, and it moves your legs for you. With time, we might even stimulate neural regrowth. But it's a start." Elise studied the diagrams, her bioinformatics training kicking in. The tech was elegant, unconventional, but grounded in principles she understood. It wasn't Helix's polished, corporate approach. It was raw, almost scrappy, like Daniel himself. "How long?" she asked. 6 months to fit and calibrate," he said. "Maybe less if you're as stubborn as I think you are." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, and Elise felt something she hadn't in years: hope, sharp and dangerous. Margaret cut in. "This is reckless. Unvetted tech, no FDA approval, no peer review. You're gambling with my daughter's life." Her voice trembled, not with fear but with the rage of someone who'd built her life on control. Daniel stood, meeting her gaze. "I'm not gambling. I've run the numbers. The risks are real, but so's the potential. Elise isn't a child. She can decide for herself." The room waited for Margaret's explosion, but Elise spoke first. "I want to try it." Her voice was quiet but unyielding, like steel wrapped in silk. Margaret's face crumpled for a split second before hardening again. "We'll discuss this privately," she said, dismissing the room with a wave. The scientists and investors filed out, casting curious glances at Daniel. He didn't move, waiting for Elise's lead. Later, in Margaret's office, the air was thick with tension. Elise sat by the desk, her hands clenched in her lap. Daniel stood by the door, his satchel slung over his shoulder. Margaret paced, her voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're asking," she said to Elise. "This man's a nobody, a consultant with a pet project. He's using you to make a name for himself." Elise's eyes flashed. "He's the first person who's asked what I want, not what you want, not what Helix wants." "Me?" Margaret froze, stung. Elise turned to Daniel. "Tell me about you. Why do you care so much?" Daniel hesitated, then spoke. "My son, Liam, he's 8. He was born with cerebral palsy. I started this work for him, to give him a chance at moving freely. He's too young for the system now, but you're not. If it works for you, it could work for him someday." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of pain. Elise nodded, understanding more than she said. Margaret's voice softened, but only slightly. "If we do this, it's under my terms, full oversight, Helix resources, my team." Daniel shook his head. "It's my tech. I call the shots. You can monitor, but you don't control." Margaret bristled, but Elise cut in. "Enough. I'm doing this with him." She looked at Daniel, a silent agreement forming. For the first time in years, she felt like she was staring her own life. The next 6 months were a blur of late nights and incremental victories. Daniel's lab was a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, a far cry from Helix's gleaming facilities. It was cluttered with prototypes, wires, and coffee mugs, but it felt alive in a way Helix never did. Elise came every day, her wheelchair navigating the cluttered aisles as Daniel and his small team of 2 former grad students and a biomechanical engineer worked on the neural bypass. The frame was lightweight, almost skeletal, fitted with sensors that mapped to Elise's neural signals. She spent hours in a harness, training her brain to communicate with the device, her frustration boiling over when progress stalled. Daniel was patient but relentless, pushing her without coddling. "You're not fragile," he'd say when she faltered. "You're just stubborn enough to make this work." Liam visited sometimes, a bright-eyed kid with a lopsided grin who maneuvered his own wheelchair with reckless confidence. He'd watch Elise's sessions, cheering when the frame responded to her commands. "You're like a superhero," he told her once, and Elise laughed, the sound startling her. She hadn't laughed like that in years. Daniel watched them, his quiet pride mingling with something deeper, grief, maybe, or hope. Margaret monitored everything, her presence a constant shadow. She'd grill Daniel on every detail, her skepticism a wall he had to climb daily. But she saw the progress too, Elise's legs twitching, then stepping, jerky at first, then smoother. The neural bypass was working, not perfectly, but enough to make Margaret's throat tighten with something she hadn't felt in years, a fear of being wrong. By month 5, Elise could walk 10 steps unaided by the harness, the frame bearing most of her weight. The warehouse erupted in cheers, Liam's voice the loudest. Daniel high-fived her, his grin boyish and unguarded. Elise's heart raced, not just from the effort. She saw Daniel differently now, and not just as the engineer, but as a man who'd fought his own battles and still showed up for hers. One night, after a long session, Elise stayed late. The warehouse was quiet, just the hum of machines and the distant sound of Brooklyn traffic. Daniel was tinkering with the frame, his hands steady but his face tired. "Why do you do this?" Elise asked, her voice soft. "You could have sold this tech to Helix, made millions. Why keep it yours?" Daniel set down his tools, looking at her. "Money's not the point. I saw what happened to Liam's mama. She got lost in a system that cared more about profit than people. I didn't want that for him, or for you." He paused, then added, "You remind me of what I'm fighting for." Elise felt a warmth she hadn't expected. She reached out, her hand brushing his. For a moment, they were just two people, not a scientist and a patient, not a CEO's daughter and a single dad. Then Liam's voice called from the back, breaking the spell. "Dad, I'm hungry." Daniel laughed, the moment gone but not forgotten. By the 6th month, Elise could walk a full minute without support, her steps shaky but hers. Margaret watched the final test, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. When Elise crossed the room, Margaret's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Daniel, though, knelt beside Elise, checking the frame's readouts. "You did it," he said, his voice thick. Elise grinned, exhausted but triumphant. "We did it." Part 2. The demonstration was set for Helix's annual gala, a glittering affair where the elite of medicine and finance would see Elise walk. The ballroom was a sea of tuxedos and gowns, the air thick with champagne and ambition. Elise stood backstage, the neural bypass frame hidden beneath a sleek black dress. She was nervous, not about walking but about what came after. Helix wanted the tech, and Margaret had made that clear. She'd offered Daniel a 7-figure deal to fold his work into Synaptra, but he'd refused. "It's not about money," he'd told her. "It's about who gets access." Margaret hadn't taken it well. Daniel was beside Elise, adjusting the frame's settings. Liam sat nearby, playing a handheld game, his wheelchair parked by the curtain. "You've got this," Daniel said, his hand on her shoulder. Elise nodded, her heart steadying. She wasn't doing this for Helix or her mother, she was doing it for herself and for Liam, who'd started calling her Big Sis when he thought she wasn't listening. The lights dimmed, and Margaret took the stage, her voice commanding as she introduced Elise. "My daughter is proof of what Helix can achieve," she said, the lie smooth as silk. Elise's jaw tightened. Daniel squeezed her hand. "Show them," he whispered. Elise stepped into the spotlight, the frame humming faintly. The crowd gasped as she took her first step, then another, her movements deliberate but graceful. By the 10th step, they were on their feet, applauding. Elise's eyes found Daniel's, then Liam's, their pride brighter than the chandeliers. She reached the podium, breathless, and took the microphone. "This isn't Helix's victory," she said, her voice clear. "This is Daniel Harper's. He built this tech for people like me, like his son, and he's not selling it to anyone who'll lock it behind a paywall." The room went silent. Margaret's smile froze. Elise stepped down, her legs trembling but holding. Backstage, Daniel hugged her, Liam whooping beside them. Margaret followed, her face a storm. "You've humiliated me," she hissed. Elise met her gaze. "I've freed myself." Daniel faced Margaret. "I'm taking the tech public domain, open source. Anyone can build on it, improve it, use it." Margaret's eyes blazed. "You're throwing away billions." Daniel shrugged. "I'm giving Liam a future." And Elise. "That's enough." Elise moved out of her mother's penthouse the next week, renting a small apartment near Daniel's warehouse. She joined his team, using her bioinformatics expertise to refine the neural bypass. Liam became a fixture, his laughter filling the lab. Margaret didn't speak to Elise for months, but when she did, it was with a grudging respect. Helix pivoted, focusing on Synaptra, but the world was already buzzing with Daniel's open-source tech. Elise walked further each day, the frame less a crutch and more a partner. She and Daniel grew closer, their late-night talks turning into something neither named but both felt. One evening, as snow fell over Brooklyn, Liam asked, "Are you gonna be my mom?" Elise laughed, ruffling his hair. "Let's start with Big Sis," she said, glancing at Daniel. He smiled, and in that moment, they were firmly and not perfect, but theirs. The neural bypass spread, reaching thousands. Elise and Daniel kept working, not for glory but for the next kid, the next life. And every step Elise took was a reminder. Sometimes, the smallest act of defiance, saying "let me help," it could change everything.
The air in the congressional hearing room was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your breath catch. The chamber, usually a place of measured debate, had devolved into a verbal battlefield. Lawmakers sat in their polished wooden chairs, some fidgeting with pens, others staring intently at the two women at the center of the storm. Representative Jasmine Crockett, a Texas Democrat with a reputation for sharp wit and unyielding principles, sat poised at her desk, her dark eyes scanning the room. Across from her, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Georgia firebrand known for her provocative rhetoric, was already leaning into her microphone, her voice rising with the cadence of someone who thrived on chaos. Greene had been speaking for nearly 10 minutes, her words a torrent of grievances that veered dangerously close to inflammatory. She was railing against what she called the radical left's agenda, her voice dripping with disdain as she gestured mildly, her blonde hair catching the light of the chamber's chandeliers. The topic was a proposed bill on equitable education funding, but Greene had taken a sharp detour, veering into a diatribe about certain communities and their supposed failure to assimilate. The room grew quieter, the weight of her words settling like a fog. Some members shifted uncomfortably, while others exchanged glances, sensing the line she was crossing. Crockett, seated a few rows away, felt her pulse quicken. She'd heard this kind of rhetoric before, veiled, coded, but unmistakable in its intent. Her fingers tightened around the pen in her hand, the ink smudging slightly against her palm. She'd come to Congress prepared for moments like this, armed with a law degree, a preacher's cadence, and a fire in her gut that had been forged through years of fighting for justice in courtrooms and communities. She wasn't here to let slights pass or to coddle ignorance, but she also knew the game: speak too soon, and you're dismissed as emotional; wait too long, and the moment slips away. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Greene, waiting for the right opening. Greene's voice grew louder, her words sharper. "We can't keep pouring money into schools where parents don't care, where kids don't value education because of their culture," she said, her tone implying a specificity she didn't dare name outright. The word culture hung in the air, a dog whistle that echoed in the silence that followed. A few Republicans nodded subtly, while others stared at their desks, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. On the Democratic side, murmurs of dissent began to ripple, but no one had yet risen to challenge her. The chair of the committee, a weary-looking veteran of these battles, tapped his gavel lightly, a half-hearted attempt to steer the conversation back to the bill. Crockett's jaw tightened. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, some expectant, others wary. She knew what they were thinking. Jasmine's going to say something, and she was. She'd grown up in a world where words like Greene's weren't just rhetoric, they were weapons, used to diminish, to dehumanize. She thought of her grandmother, who'd worked 2 jobs to send her to college, and her mother, who'd taught her to stand tall against anyone who tried to tear her down. This wasn't just about policy anymore, it was personal. She raised her hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of a gauntlet thrown. The chair acknowledged her with a nod, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Greene, still standing, turned slightly, her eyes narrowing as she registered Crockett's movement. There was a flicker of something, a defiance, maybe, or amusement in Green's expression, as if she relished the challenge. Crockett stood, smoothing her blazer, her movements deliberate. She didn't need to rush. She had 10 seconds, maybe less, to cut through the noise and make her point. But she'd done this before, in courtrooms and community centers, dismantling arguments with precision and leaving no room for rebuttal. Representative Green, Crockett began, her voice low but clear, slicing through the tension like a blade. You speak of a culture as if it's a monolith, as if some people are inherently unfit to learn or thrive. Let me remind you that the only thing failing here is your understanding of history. The room stilled further, every head turning toward her. Green's face twitched, her lips parting as if to interrupt, but Crockett didn't pause. You want to talk about value? The communities you're so quick to dismiss have been systematically underfunded, redlined, and overlooked for generations, and not because of their culture, but because of policies you seem all too eager to defend. Her words were sharp, each one landing like a well-aimed dart. She didn't trace her voice, she didn't need to. Her tone carried the weight of someone who'd spent years arguing cases, preaching truth, and calling out nonsense. The chamber was silent now, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of papers. Green's expression hardened, her hands gripping the edge of her desk as if to steady herself. Crockett continued, her cadence steady, her gaze unwavering. If you want to talk about assimilation, let's talk about who's been forced to assimilate into a system that wasn't built for them, who's had to fight twice as hard for half the opportunity. You don't get to stand here and lecture about value when your words drip with the same old prejudice dressed up in new clothes. The room erupted in murmurs, some shocked, others approving. A few Democrats clapped softly, while Republicans exchanged uneasy glances. The chair tapped his gavel again, but it was clear he had no intention of stopping Crockett. She was within her time, and her words were too precise, too cutting, to be dismissed as a rant. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. You have 10 seconds to retract that nonsense, or we can keep this going. But I warn you, I've got facts, history, and truth on my side, and I'm not here to play games. Green's face flushed red, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She wasn't used to being challenged like these, and not so directly, not so publicly. The 10 seconds ticked by in silence, her opportunity to respond slipping away. Crockett didn't wait for her to recover. She sat down, her posture regal, her expression calm but unyielding. The message was clear, she'd said what needed saying, and she wasn't backing down. The hearing moved on, but the energy in the room had shifted. Green's allies tried to pivot back to the bill, but their arguments felt hollow, overshadowed by Crockett's words. Social media was already lighting up outside the chamber, clips of the exchange spreading like wildfire. Hashtags like #JasmineCrockett and #ShutItDown began trending, with users praising her for calling out what many saw as thinly veiled racism. Others, predictably, accused her of playing the race card, but even those critiques lacked the fire of conviction. Crockett had struck a nerve, and the reverberations were felt far beyond the walls of Congress. As the session broke for recess, Crockett gathered her notes, her face betraying no hint of the adrenaline still coursing through her. Colleagues approached, some offering quiet nods of respect, others whispering words of encouragement. She smiled politely but kept moving, her mind already on the next fight. This wasn't her first battle, and it wouldn't be her last. But for now, she'd done what she came to do, speak truth to power, in 10 seconds flat. The fallout was immediate. By evening, the clip of Crockett's takedown was everywhere in news channels, X posts, even late-night talk shows. Pundits dissected her words, some calling her a rising star, others warning she'd made a powerful enemy in Green. But Crockett wasn't fazed. Back in her office, she sipped coffee, scrolling through messages from constituents who felt seen, heard, and defended. Green, meanwhile, doubled down, posting a defiant thread on X that only fueled the fire. The nation watched, divided but riveted, as two visions of America clashed in a moment that would echo for years.